Okay, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about World War One, and we just want to go ahead and just quickly give a little overview and cover briefly some of the main points. Now, first, some of the main causes of World War One. There's four basic causes that we're going to go ahead and go over. First is nationalism. Basically, nationalism is not just pride in one's nation, but pride without consideration of others. So, in other words, your nation is the most important, and what other nations want is completely irrelevant, which just is patently untrue. Obviously, if you go ahead and you completely ignore the needs and the wants of other nations, you're eventually going to get into a fight, and that doesn't serve anybody's interests, which is what happened in World War One. Great examples of nationalism. For instance, Serbia is probably the most significant example because the nationalist group known as the Black Hand in Serbia is what really leads us into the conflict. They have a disagreement with Austro-Hungarian Empire over Bosnia. They think Bosnia should be part of Serbia, and the Black Hand is protesting for that. Leads to the assassination of the Archduke, which we're going to get into in a little bit more in just a little bit here. France, very nationalist feelings with Alsace and Lorraine, two provinces which had been taken by Germany in the Franco-Prussian War, and so France really wants those back. And so those are underlying tensions that really kind of go ahead and lead us into World War One. But the direct trigger, again, being Serbia and the Black Hand, a nationalist group out of Serbia. Militarism, or the glorification of the military, leads to an arms race in Europe, in particular, a naval arms race, but not just simply a naval arms race. Also, leads to the development of bigger guns, more ammunition, things like chemical weapons, things like tanks and flamethrowers and everything else. So really, militarism isn't so much a cause of World War I per se as it is really one of the things that leads to World War I being as nasty as it got and as deadly as it got. One of the things that also leads us into World War I is imperialism. As the European countries are gaining more and more wealth, getting larger and larger, they're bumping into each other all over the world, in particular in Africa. And this, again, leads just to further hostilities and further fear and anger over different disagreements all around the globe, leading up to World War I. Another great example would be Russia. Russia was continually nipping right around the edges of the Ottoman Empire to go ahead and expand its own empire. Places like Romania, places like Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, stuff like that. They were fomenting and encouraging rebellions against the Ottomans in order to go ahead and gain those territories more under their own power. So again, imperialism leads us into the conflict. But by far and away, the thing that really kind of sets the whole thing up is an alliance system. The alliance system, ironically enough, was really meant to provide security, to prevent further conflict. You had very large powers that all aligned, and they were defensive alliances. So Britain, France, and Russia form what's called the Triple Entente. And they go ahead and they basically say, hey, if you attack one of us, you attack all of us. Please don't attack us. And they thought that would be enough to deter anybody, because nobody would be crazy enough to attack all three. The Triple Alliance was similar: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And again, they were meant to provide security. These basically turn into different sides during World War II. The Triple Entente turns into the Allied powers, except that Italy doesn't stick with it. It hops over and becomes part of the Allies. And then the Triple Alliance, Germany and Austria-Hungary, become the Central Powers, and they recruit another buddy when Italy leaves. They recruit the Ottoman Empire. That's how they get drug into the thing. And so those are the alliances that really kind of end up triggering the war, even though they were meant to prevent it. What really sets it all off, though, is a secret alliance between Russia and Serbia. It was, again, a defensive alliance. Russia promised to come to Serbia's aid if it were attacked, but Russia kept this deal secret. Nobody knew. And so that really drastically impacts a lot of the decisions that people make, and really is another thing that gets us into this war. So treaties that were meant to be defensive, that were meant to go ahead and keep and prevent further conflict, end up getting us into trouble. So how do they do that? Well, it's because of the assassination of one guy, Archduke Ferdinand. This is the trigger that starts World War I. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and he and his wife Sophie go down to Sarajevo to go ahead and try to see if they can smooth over some problems with some Serbian nationalists down in Bosnia. On June 28, 1914, a teenager, a 19-year-old, Gavrilo Princip, assassinates both the Archduke and his wife. He is arrested. He dies in prison a few years later, in 1918, tuberculosis and different things like that. But nonetheless, the damage is done. Austria-Hungary tries to go ahead and settle things with Serbia, but it doesn't work out. And Austria-Hungary goes ahead and declares war on Serbia. At this point, this kicks in the secret agreement that nobody knew about, and Russia declares war and gets involved with Austria-Hungary, which brings Germany in, because remember, this is a defensive alliance. And so from a span of July 28th through August 12th, really it's even less time than that, but over the span of really just a relatively few number of days, Austria, Hungary, Russia, Germany, France, Great Britain, all of Europe is at war with one another and declares war on one another, getting drawn into this again by the alliance system. So now that the war started, Italy realizes pretty quick this is a bad deal for the Central Powers, that they're surrounded. And so that's why Italy doesn't stay with the Central Powers. Italy goes ahead and joins the Allies. Germany also realizes this. Hey, this is a bad situation. We're fighting France and Great Britain on one side, Russia on the other. Any general who's worth his salt knows you can't win a two-front war. And so a general by the name of Alfred von Schlieffen, who was a German, comes up with a plan for what to do in case this happens. He comes up with a plan in 1905, so this was well thought out. It's called a contingency plan. It's what generals do when they're not fighting a war. They think about what they would do if they actually had to fight a war. Basically, what von Schlieffen proposed was call for an invasion of Belgium. You go through there in a couple days, you get into France. France isn't going to expect it. You're going to knock them out of the war real quick, and then you don't have a two-front war anymore. Then you can go ahead and turn your focus to Russia and just focus on one and be satisfied with that. Unfortunately, it doesn't work out that way. The plan bogs down, and the French don't fall quickly, and it leads to a big stalemate that we call trench warfare. But don't worry about von Schlieffen's plan. It doesn't work so good in 1914, but it works great in 1936. They use the same exact plan again, and this time France falls for it yet again. So, the trench warfare, again, not an intended tactic, but it's what World War I devolves into. It's probably what World War I is best known for. It lasts for a span of about 4 years where basically nobody takes any land. The land between the trenches just became absolutely littered with craters and dead bodies. There wasn't a single growing thing left in there. Anything that was in there was dead, and that's why it was referred to as no man's land. No man went there. It didn't belong to anybody, and it was a complete disaster. One of the most significant battles where they tried to go ahead and break through the trenches was the Battle of the Somme. It was the largest offensive of the war. It was a British offensive. By the time it's all said and done, over 1 million people will be dead or wounded. The battle itself lasts for about 5 months, from July to November, and again remains one of the bloodiest, if not the bloodiest battle in the history of human conflict. What a great distinction. Other tactics that were commonly used besides trench warfare, naval blockades, were used by both really the British and the Germans to pretty good effect. At least good effect if you're looking for, death and destruction. The British, who have the superior surface fleet, they have a conventional kind of blockade. They include war materials and different things like that. They widen it to include fertilizers, and this causes a huge, widespread famine in Germany in 1917. It's a violation of the rules of war because the British are blockading neutral ports and they're stopping neutral ships, which really ticks off the United States. We really didn't like that too much. But they're not sinking ships. They're not killing people. They're pulling people over. They're stopping them. They're searching the ship. If there's nothing in there that's against their blockade, they go ahead and let it through. And while they're not supposed to do it, it's really just a minor inconvenience. The Germans, on the other hand, don't have a very good surface fleet, or at least they don't have one that they think is that they're willing to give up to take on the British, and so they send the submarines out to do the blockading. This is unconventional. Submarines are not good at stopping ships and boarding them. Submarines are good at sinking ships, unannounced. So the German submarines begin sinking merchant ships all across the Atlantic. They're merchant ships, they're unarmed, and there's no warning. So a lot of people are killed. Probably the most famous example of this is the Lusitania, which wasn't even a merchant ship, it was a passenger liner. The Lusitania gets sunk, killing over 1,000 people, 123 of which are Americans, which really ticks us off even more. And again, it's a violation of the rules of war. So both sides were kind of guilty of this, although the German violation is a little more egregious because it involves killing lots of civilians. Although the Germans could make the argument that the British blockade was killing lots of civilians too, they just happened to all be Germans. In fact, the British blockade ends up killing, I've heard numbers as high as 17 million people in Germany. So absolutely devastating the famine of 1917. Another thing that happens in the war that really kind of changes the character of the war is the Russian Revolution, March 1917 to October 1917. This will go ahead, on October 17, the communists will take over Russia, and this will lead to them signing a treaty in March of 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Sorry, I butchered that pronunciation a little bit. And the Russians pull out. This is bad news for the Allies. We realize this is happening. We get involved in the war in April of 1917 because the truth of the matter is we are kind of leaning towards the Allies. We like the British because, let's face it, we're British. We like the French because, let's face it, they were our earliest friends. They helped us to beat the British in our revolution. So we've always kind of sided with them. And so when Russia leaves the war, we realize this is bad news for our friends, and this prompts us to go ahead and get into the war. But we were reluctant participants. We didn't really want to be in the war. Woodrow Wilson runs his entire campaign for president in 1916, his re-election campaign, that he would go ahead and keep us out of war. He's elected in 1916. A few months later, April of 1917, we're in the war. But Woodrow Wilson, not to go ahead and completely concede, says, yeah, but we're not in it for selfish reasons. We're in this because we want to make the world safe for democracy. It is a noble cause. We are altruistic. We're not doing this to gain land or anything else. And so we're going to go ahead, we're in it to end it, was kind of, I guess, his slogan. And so why did we get drawn in? Again, the Lusitania, the Zimmermann Note, which basically was a note that Germany sent excuse me, to Mexico saying, hey, if you get in the war, we'll give you Texas, Arizona, and California back. And all of a sudden, the British intercept the note, and they say, hey, United States, look what we found. We're like, oh, shoot. And then we decide, well, maybe we should get into this thing. Then the Russians pull out, and we're like, now. So now Americans are dying on the Lusitania. American sovereignty is being threatened via the Zimmermann Note. And our side, that we kind of wanted to win anyway, looks like it's going to lose. This is a bad deal all the way around. We get in the war. So once we get in the war, what do? Well, we passed the Selective Service Act in 1917, where 4.2 million people are drafted. 2 million of those actually make it overseas. We start the War Industries Board, which regulates railroads and every other kind of industry you can think of, and is headed by Bernard Baruch. The Food Administration, headed by future President Herbert Hoover, encourages Americans to grow victory gardens so that all the produce from our farms can go overseas. And we establish the War Labor Board, collective bargaining, where labor unions get collective bargaining, they get wage increases. In return, they're not allowed to strike. If they go strike, boom. Straight in, straight to the war, straight to the front. Bummer. Then finally, the ceasefire and the Treaty of Versailles. The ceasefire happens on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in, it would be nice to say 1911, but it's not. It's 1918. And so we go ahead and have the ceasefire. This is what we call Veterans Day in the United States today. It used to be known as Armistice Day, but that's when the guns stop. The Treaty of Versailles then. Treaty of Versailles is negotiated by what are called the Big Four. Woodrow Wilson for the U.S., Lloyd George for Great Britain, Clemenceau for France, and Orlando for Italy. No Central Powers are involved in this notice, and neither is Russia, because remember, Russia already signed a treaty. We'll get to that in a little bit. So, these are the Big Four. They go ahead and negotiate the treaty. Clemenceau wants revenge, Wilson wants peace, Lloyd George is stuck in the middle, and everybody ignores Orlando. Lloyd George ends up buckling to Clemenceau, so Woodrow Wilson is kind of out, and the Treaty of Versailles turns into a treaty that's all about, really not peace, but revenge against Germany. Wilson's 14 points. Wilson comes in wanting the League of Nations self-determination, no secret treaties, treatment of the colonies, free oceans, and all of them are ignored so that he can get the League of Nations. The terms are brutal. The Germans are appalled. They're forced to sign a treaty which says they're guilty for the entire war, which of course is crazy because really the war started with Austria, Hungary, Serbia, and Russia. And the Germans are forced to pay war reparations. In other words, they're supposed to pay up for all the damage they caused. And depending on, there's not actually a number listed in the treaty, but depending on different sources, I've read anywhere from 33 to 32 million, or billion, all the way up to $54 billion. Nonetheless, what ends up happening is Germany finally makes its last payment in 2013, and hey, they can finally put the war behind them. Ooh. So the results of the treaty, Germany loses land, Russia loses land, which is weird because Russia already signed a treaty, so how did they lose land? And they weren't even at that, and they fought on the winning side. Since when do you fight on the winning side and lose land in a war? I don't know how that works. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is broken up and is no more. The Ottoman Empire is also broken up. And in other results of the war, more long-lasting results, those were the immediate ones, the first four, World War II. It can be argued as a result of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. The Great Depression, yeah, you could make that decision too. The Cold War, yep, yeah, Russia doesn't trust us anymore. The Arab-Israeli conflict, yeah, you can make a claim for that one too. Vietnam, it turns out there's a little guy by the name of Ho Chi Minh shows up, sorry about the little politically incorrect statement, shows up to knock on Woodrow Wilson's door, says, hey, Mr. Wilson, we're Vietnamese and we don't want to be French. We're not French. Can we be our own country? Wilson says, no, throws him out. He says, oh, I don't like the Americans anymore. And he goes ahead and turns to the communists. And we end up having to fight Vietnam. Great. Good call, Woodrow. Anyway, that's the result of World War I. Thanks.